All right, well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out to our next edition of our guest speaker series. This month, in honor of Black History Month, we have Patrick Ryan here from the Buffalo History Museum. He is their education and programming coordinator. He also runs their podcast and does their videos on YouTube, so if you check them out, you'll probably see his face. But he'll be talking about William Wells Brown, who was a former slave and abolitionist in the Buffalo area. So, Patrick, take it away.
Perfect. First off, thank the Holland Museum. Always, Ryan does a great job, so big thanks to him for setting this all up, and hopefully we'll have you at our location maybe this fall for a talk as well. But yeah, tonight, like Ryan was saying, we're going to talk about a gentleman who, you may have heard of some of the bigger names when it comes to the abolitionist cause, right? Like Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, Charles Reason. But I think that there's a gentleman who has connections to Buffalo that not a lot of people know about in the Western New York area, and I think that's a shame. And his name was William Wells Brown. He is this gentleman right here. So before we get right into his specific story, we have to talk a little bit about why we're talking about this man, and that's probably 19th century America's biggest downfall, right? That's slavery. The biggest stain on the moral fabric of the United States at this time, right? How could a country founded in the principles of liberty and freedom at the same time hold thousands of people enslaved, right? So just a few quick facts about what they called at the time the peculiar institution. The first African slaves, they arrived in Jamestown, Virginia in the early 1600s in 1619. And throughout the 1700s, you see about 6 to 7 million enslaved peoples brought over to the Americas. What really spurs on, at least in the States, a larger focus on the slave trade was Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin in 1793, right? This makes slavery an economic advantage now, right? If you can have all of this cotton being made at a much faster rate, you're going to make money, and that's where you see the true birth of what you would consider American slavery, right? So, another kind of, point in history that is a big strengthening of that specific, peculiar Southern slavery was the Haitian Revolution in 1804. Haiti is the only country in the Western Hemisphere to have a successful slave revolt, right? The enslaved peoples rose up against their French abductors and holders, kicked them off the island, and in the process, right, it was a violent uprising. This absolutely scared Southern Americans quite a bit, right? And this is where you see that tightening on slavery, where it kind of moves into your more chattel bondage, if you will. And by the time you get to the 1850s, about 1/3 of the southern United States is of African descent, and there are certain states where it's even more crazy than that. South Carolina, for example, by 1850, there are 400,000 enslaved people, 10,000 free blacks, and only about 200,000 whites. So they more than double the number of their captors. And that is why slavery and southern culture, well, they become intertwined, right? So, like I said, you've probably heard of William Lloyd Garrison, you've probably heard of gentlemen like Frederick Douglass. William Wells Brown follows pretty much the closest trajectory to Frederick Douglass that you can get. A former enslaved person who escapes, becomes a writer, orator, and we'll leave the spoilers at that, right? So, William Wells Brown, he was born simply William, or because his master's son was also named William, they referred to him as Sanford, a name that he always detested. And he was born in 1840, about 40 miles outside, that's supposed to say 1804, my apologies, about 40 miles outside of Lexington, Kentucky. His father, he was a white slave owner by the name of George Higgins, and he had William with one of his slaves. When Brown was just a young lad, though, however, he was given it to George Higgins' cousin, Dr. John Young. And that is where he ends up getting that name Sanford, because it was actually Dr. Young's son who already had the name William. So, Dr. Young, he was kind of a big deal in Missouri. They moved there. He starts a tobacco and hemp farm, and he becomes one of the first legislators in the history of Missouri State. So what does that mean? He is forced to leave the plantation, and he hands the keys over basically to more or less, his overseer, Grove Cook. And Grove Cook, this man terrified William. This is where he really firsthand, as a young child, saw the horrible life that unfortunately was already laid out for him, right? In his personal narrative, I guess that's a spoiler again, but he talks a little bit about how one of the first days that Grove Cook was in charge of the plantation, he whipped his mother viciously almost 50 times. Her crime, she was about 5 minutes late to working on the fields that day. So, they were already in Missouri, but when William is about 12 years old, Dr. Young relocates to St. Louis, Missouri. And when you no longer have a farm and you have a bunch of enslaved people, right, it's all about money. People would routinely rent out their slaves to people who needed them. And William, he was no exception. The first person that he was rented out to was a gentleman that in his narrative he refers to as Major Freeland. And in Brown's own words, Freeland was a drunkard, a card player, a gambler, and a horse racer. Some pretty terrible crimes. But what really made Major Freeland terrifying to young William was that he was known for his cruelty. And he often engaged in something called Virginia play. That was his own words for it. And, you know, just like a trigger warning on all this stuff, it's horrible, it's really bad, obviously, but it happened, so I'm going to talk about it. Virginia play. What was this? Well, when Major Freeland had an enslaved person that he deemed to be acting out, or whatever the terminology they used at the time was, here's what they did. They would take an enslaved person, they would hang them upside down by their ankles in a small shed. And the reason why it's called Virginia play is they would take Virginia tobacco, burn it at their feet, and by the time that slave's lungs filled with smoke and their feet were burned to an acceptable level according to the master, they would be cut down. And William saw this firsthand. And because he saw this, he makes his first of many escape attempts. This time, though, he's only about 12, 13 years old. He runs off in the woods, really has nowhere to go, and eventually is returned. So, like I said, William, he's rented out again and again and again. And between the years 1817 and 1825, he experiences pretty much all the horrible things that slavery has to offer. The first gentleman that he's rented out to was Captain Culver. He operated a steamship which went up and down the Mississippi River. And again, kind of like that first overseer, Grove Cook, William again sees really the horrors of slavery firsthand. In his narrative, he details one account where one of the kitchen staff at the Colburn's home was whipped, again, just about 50 times. And this person's crime? The master said that he didn't polish the dining silverware to his liking. But he does end up encountering someone that he, in his own words, called an agreeable master. And that was Elijah P. Lovejoy. And we may be familiar with him because later on in life he actually goes on to become a very noted abolitionist, running his newspaper from St. Louis. If you're familiar with his story, he actually becomes one of the calling cards for the North and anti-slavery, because eventually he is murdered by a pro-slavery mob right outside of his print house when it's burned down. But for the sake of William's story, yes, he is rented out, and this time to Elijah P. Lovejoy, which is kind of an interesting situation, right? You have an abolitionist using slavery to advance their economic gain. But we'll stop there with that discussion. Originally, he's from New England, and he treats William definitely different from his other masters. He allows William to, take breaks. He pays William. He teaches him the basics of reading and writing. And Lovejoy, you'll see, his paper, the St. Louis Observer, becomes more and more inherently anti-slavery throughout his life. But one thing about St. Louis, especially at the time, it was a lot like places like Natchez or New Orleans. These are areas that basically their entire economy was based on slavery, and there were also locations that slavery was really at its most cruel. And in his narrative, to kind of explain a lot of these problems that William saw when he was in St. Louis, he details the story of Francis McIntosh. And here's how this story goes. Essentially, there's a criminal running away from two police officers. The police officers, they stop Francis McIntosh and they say, "Excuse me, sir, can you help us catch this criminal?" Well, McIntosh, he's not a police officer. He refuses. When he refuses, the two white police, they decide to arrest him. And now McIntosh, he knows that being a black American in St. Louis in the early 1800s, he's got no shot at a fair trial, right? So he attempts to escape. In the escape attempt, one of the officers is actually killed. Well, the city of St. Louis, they find McIntosh, they bring him downtown, and it's there that he's actually burned at the stake in front of thousands of people. That's not all though, because the way that story ends, after he's burned to the stake and his body was lying there, the young white children of St. Louis threw rocks in an attempt to shatter his skull afterwards as a game. So that describes a little bit of kind of the vibe in St. Louis at the time. And William, unfortunately for him, he gets very close to a story very similar, like McIntosh. So when he was working for Lovejoy's print shop, he would routinely pick up print from the Missouri Republican. And on one of the days that he goes to pick up the print, he's accosted by a small group of white children, white boys specifically. They try to steal the print from him, they try, insulting him, they throw things at him like stones and rocks, and eventually William, to get away from them, pushes one of the children and makes his way back to the Lovejoy print shop. Well, this white kid's father did not take it very kindly, Samuel McKinney. He shows up to the print shop, and before he can get his hands on William escapes through a back door. Problem solved, right? Unfortunately, William suffers a very horrific encounter just a few days after that. While he's out for a walk, just minding his own business, the father of this son grabs him with a giant wooden cane and repeatedly strikes him over the head. Now, William recalls blood pouring down from his face. He couldn't hear, and he was in bed for over a month after this incident. After he had healed, though, no surprise, he is rented out again. And this time he is rented out to William Walker, who was another steamship operator and owner. And his ship was called the Enterprise. What was the Enterprise's main function? Well, it was a slave vessel, right? The international slave trade is made illegal in 1807, but that speaks nothing to the American domestic slave trade, right? This runs right up to the Civil War. And William, unfortunately, he sees quite a few horrific things while he's on this ship. The ship could hold up to 60, maybe 70 enslaved people at a time. And the first thing that William talks about was when he was helping out on the boat, he watched in horror as an African-American woman threw herself overboard and drowned herself because she was separated from her child. So, what other horrible things did William see while working on the Enterprise? Well, when it reached New Orleans, he was tasked with helping make the slaves ready for purchase. What did that mean? Well, he was tasked with dyeing the hair of elderly slaves black with oil so that they were more able and more fit to work in the fields. Now, Walker, the gentleman that he's working under, as if all of these things were not bad enough, his depravity knows no bounds. While William is working for him, Mr. Walker, he purchases an enslaved person by the name of Cynthia and actually has 2 children with her. What does Walker do though? Eventually, he marries a white woman and he sells his entire biological family into slavery, his wife and his 2 children. Well, not wife, mistress, I guess would be the word. So, after this time on Walker's ship where he really experiences the horrors of slavery firsthand, he heads back to St. Louis. And it's here that his biological cousin, right, remember that's who his original owner is, Dr. Young, tells him that he's going to sell his sister and his mother. And after this revelation, basically William, he visits his sister one last time, and she is sold into slavery into Natchez, never to be seen again. William, however, he didn't want this same fate to befall his mother. So he devises a plan to escape. William and his mother, they steal a boat, and their plan is to sail up to Canada, to free land. Well, the plan starts out great. They actually reach as far as Illinois. Unfortunately, while they're there, Dr. Young, he put out, I guess we'll call it like a warrant for their capture, and a group of slave catchers surround the pair and take them back to St. Louis. William, in his narrative, he makes a very interesting point. He touches on the hypocritical Christianity in 1800s America, where men of the lowest order, slave catchers, broke out into prayer to celebrate their latest catch. So once he's returned to Dr. Young, William and his mother, they're permitted to see each other one last time. And William's mother, she tells him, listen, I'm not fit for plantation life. I'm an older woman. This is probably the last time you're going to see me, and you can't worry about me. Your new goal is to find freedom for yourself. So William, after he says goodbye to his mother, after another unsuccessful escape from slavery, He's rented out first to a merchant by the name of Samuel Willie, and then rented out to another steamship operator. However, was not working in that capacity for the Price family. He was purchased for $700, and he worked for Enoch Price and his wife as a carriage driver. Now, something that happened quite a bit when it came to slavery in the Americas in 1800s was white plantation owners would basically create false or forced familial ties to keep their slaves from wanting to run away. And Enoch Price, he was no exception. And in an attempt to secure William's loyalty, the Prices, they buy, in William's words, a pretty enslaved girl named Eliza. And they want him to marry her because they figure if he's married and he has kids, he's not going to want to escape. Well, William sees right through the plan, and basically he just lies to them and says, oh yeah, for sure, I definitely want to marry her, don't worry about it, like I'll do it, I'm just not ready yet. So, the Price family, they need to go do business in Cincinnati, and again, William is their carriage driver. And he tells them before they go to, again, the free state of Ohio, trust me, no, I'm in love with Eliza, like, I'm going to marry her, don't worry about it, I won't run away. On January 1st, 1834, William travels with the Price family to an area called Cairo in Ohio. As soon as they stop, William runs into the woods and makes his third attempt at escape. His whole plan is to follow the North Star of Canada. Unfortunately for William, when you are attempting to escape pretty much anywhere close to Buffalo, Ohio, areas like that, it's going to be terrible weather, right? So William, it was snowy, he had no overcoat, and he attempted to travel just about 20 miles a day north through the Ohio snow, right? And as if that wasn't bad enough, as an escaped slave, you couldn't use main roads. So think about deep snow through the woods, through the thicket, whatever you want to call it. After 8 days of basically making his way through the woods, doing everything he can to survive, and that included finding old farmhouses with old corn that he ate to stay alive, he realizes that he needs help. If he stays out in these elements for too much longer, his whole escape attempt will be for nothing. So he waits by the road, he sees a group of men pass by, he decides not to approach them. But eventually he sees one singular man in a large coat. And he goes up to this man and pleads his case. Luckily for young William, this man was a Quaker. And if you know anything about the Quakers, always anti-slavery, even from their inception. So this gentleman, he tells William to wait where he is and he'll be back with the carriage. And I can't even describe how nerve-wracking that must have been for William, because he doesn't know this guy. He doesn't know if he's going to come back with slave catchers and bring him back to St. Louis, but he had to trust him. It was his only option. Well, he's brought back to the Quaker's house, and there he is given new clothes and food. And astonishingly to William, it's the first time that he has ever sat and had dinner with a white man and a white woman at the same table. Like I said, they supply him with new clothes and food for his journey north, but they supply young William with something else. This Quaker man who had helped rescue him, his name was Wells Brown, and he imparts his name onto young William. William, the enslaved person, is now William Wells Brown. So, what does he do next? Well, he heads up north to Cleveland, Ohio. The whole goal is to get across the Great Lakes to Canada. Unfortunately, again, it's January, and the lake is frozen. So he actually remains in Cleveland for quite a bit of time. But a funny anecdote he was a very humorous guy in his writings. On his way to Ohio, he stops at another house to ask for, some help, for some lodging, for some food. When the husband answers the door, he turns William away. Well, the wife sees what's going on. She rushes to the door, basically, shoos her husband away and says, "Come on in, William." And in his personal writings, William states, "Ever since the incident, I've been in favor of women's rights." But yes, so when he arrives to the Canadian border, it's frozen. So he spends 2 years in Cleveland, and it's there that he marries a free woman of color by the name of Elizabeth Schooner. And it's here that he also learns a little bit more. Obviously, Lovejoy taught him the basics of reading and writing, but those are just the basics. And he turns his attention to the book and the pen. And it's while he's in Cleveland that he reads abolitionist newspapers for the first time. Works like Universal Emancipation. And it's there that he realizes that not all white people are pro-slavery, and I could be doing more to help my fellow enslaved peoples. So what does he do? He moves to Buffalo, New York, right? Slavery had been abolished in New York State in 1827. That's why you see a lot of abolitionists in New York State. Rochester, Buffalo, people like Frederick Douglass, Henry Highland Garnett, William Wells Brown. And he moves to 13 Pine Street in downtown Buffalo. If you're looking for the sign, it's not there anymore. We tried to go find it, not there. And now it's a church. He joined the Western New York Anti-Slavery Society, and while he's a part of this society, he starts touring around Western New York, advocating for the anti-slavery cause. He ends up becoming quite the noted orator, and he was a little bit different from his contemporaries. He would use backing music, and this made him always a draw. Unfortunately, though, even if you're living in Buffalo, a very northern city, you are still going to face racism as someone advocating for anti-slavery. And like I said, Buffalo is no exception. When he went to East Aurora, he was pelted with food and stones. Other kind of cities on the outside, similar things happened. Other things that he did while he was in the Queen City, he started his own temperance society in Buffalo, the first of its kind, and it had about 500 members at its peak. But what did he do for work? Well, William, he finds work doing what he's always been doing, working on a steamship. However, this time there's a little bit of a twist. While operating this steamship, Brown would smuggle escaped slaves across the border to Canada. He spends just a little over a decade in Buffalo, and according to him in his journal, in only one 6-month period, he personally helped guide 70 enslaved people to freedom. So times that by 20 for 10 years, quite an astonishing number. Other things that he did while he was in the Buffalo area, he would routinely travel to Niagara Falls with other abolitionists, where, again, Niagara Falls, just as it is today, is a tourist attraction, and southern wealthy plantation owners would often visit it with their slaves. Well, Brown and other abolitionists, they would whisper in their slaves' ears when they were a little far from the master, and they would say, hey, Canada's right here, and you're in a free state. Just reminding them that maybe they could find freedom like he had. So, like I said, Buffalo is a hotbed of abolitionism in the mid-1800s, and it is chosen as the site for the National Convention of Colored Citizens. And this is started by Charles L. Reason and Henry Moxley. And Brown, because of his noted oratory, he is invited to attend. And it's there that he actually meets Frederick Douglass for the first time. Brown makes a name for himself, and like I said, he becomes one of the most noted anti-slavery minds. And he is taken note of by William Lloyd Garrison, who was the founder and pretty much chief runner of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. His newspaper, The Liberator, is probably the most famous anti-slavery newspaper of the time. And he takes note of Brown, and he invites him to move to Boston and join him in 1847. And just like that, Brown's time in Buffalo comes to an end, but not his story. The Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, like I said, it was founded by William Lloyd Garrison, and Brown's decision to actually join Garrison leads to a fissure in his relationship with Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass had worked with William Lloyd Garrison, but however they differed over one crucial issue, and that was constitutional interpretation. What does that mean? Well, William Lloyd Garrison, he saw the Constitution as inherently pro-slavery, as a document in itself, meaning that the proper and normal political process could not be used because we were a pro-slavery country. Frederick Douglass, on the other hand, saw the Constitution not as a pro-slavery document and wanted to use the proper political process to advance his rights, right? Does that make sense? Yeah? So Brown decides to join with Garrison, and like I said, that actually leads to a bit of a fissure with his relationship with Douglass. But much like Douglass, while he's in Boston, he authors and eventually has published his narrative, William Wells Brown, A Fugitive Slave. And that details all of these horrors that I just talked about while he was enslaved. And it becomes one of the best-selling books of the time. Funny enough, it was second on the bestsellers list only to his rival Frederick Douglass, who had written his narrative 2 years before. So in 1849, Brown, he realizes that England, they are a huge, or at least huge potential ally when it came to the anti-slavery cause, because they abolished slavery in 1833, and pretty much most public sentiment in England at the time was anti-slavery. So he travels there in 1849, but unfortunately for him, while he is there, a new piece of legislation comes across the US Senate, and that is the Compromise of 1850. An omnibus bill is authored by Henry Clay, and it is signed off by Whig President Millard Fillmore of Buffalo fame. So what was the Compromise of 1850 all about? Well, like I said, this is a unionist bill, basically designed to be a bridge document between the North and the South to avoid war. And here are some of the stipulations. It added California as a free state. The slave trade is abolished in D.C. They settled the Texas-New Mexico border, and they award Texas $10 million. And Utah and New Mexico were designated as territories and could decide on slavery using popular sovereignty. The one that I skipped was a stricter enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act, and this is something that Fillmore gets killed on by historians today. And basically what that meant was, even if you were an enslaved person who escaped to somewhere like Ohio or Buffalo, New York, because you were seen as nothing more than property, you had to be returned to your master. And if you were a white person helping, you could be charged as well. So much stricter enforcement, and while William is in England, he realizes, I have reached a fame that I didn't even think I could attain. If I return to the States now that this Fugitive Slave Act has been signed, there's a good chance that I might find myself in slavery again. So while in England, he wastes no time, he picks up the pen. And he writes what I like to call his magnum opus, and that is called Clotel. Clotel is a fictional account of Thomas Jefferson's relationship with his slave Sally Hemings. And basically it just details the hypocrisy behind all of these things, how Thomas Jefferson, one of these revered democratic heroes in the pantheon of American history, owned slaves and used them as his mistresses. And the book is an instant success. It's the first time, that an African American has openly challenged these American ideals on such a grand scale. And it's an instant success, like I said, it sees several editions, it's super popular in England. And this makes William Mose Brown the first African American to be a published novelist, which is pretty awesome. So, in 1854, a group of friends officially purchased William's freedom, a group of his friends in England. And he returns to Boston to continue his work with William Lloyd Garrison and the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. Because we know he likes to write, he does not put down the pen. And in 1858, he authors The Escape, which details an African American's escape from slavery. Now, not only could he be the first novelist, he is now, after this was published, the first African American to be a published playwright as well. So, just a quick recap, we have an enslaved person who didn't know how to read or write, who escaped from slavery, became one of the nation's leading orators, writers, and the first published African American, all in about 25 to 30 years. So, obviously, we have to talk about the Civil War if we're talking about slavery, right? And as it was kind of looming, as they would say, Brown, he was actually not a big fan of Lincoln. He saw the Civil War as a white man's conflict, and he didn't really believe that freedom was coming to enslaved Africans at the time. So what does he do? He joins a movement called the Haitian movement, or the Haitian immigration movement. Very similar to the ACS, or American colonization movement of the early 1820s. And just for some background on the ACS, that was founded by white Americans. Henry Clay, John Randolph, James Monroe was a big active part in that. And the whole idea was, because of what happened in Haiti, I remember I mentioned that Haitian Revolution, people thought that if you freed the slaves, there would be a race war immediately. So the whole idea was the United States government, they purchase an area in Africa, they name it Liberia, they make the capital Monrovia, and the whole idea is to incrementally bring a few thousand enslaved people back to Africa per year. Now, this was a little bit different, though. The Haitian immigration movement, that is headed by Black Americans, specifically Henry Highland Garnett. And the whole idea was for them not to be forced to emigrate, but for them to move back to Haiti and basically start their lives as non-enslaved people. Now, William, however, he does change his stance quite a bit. While he's lecturing in Canada, he ends up coming to terms with Lincoln and kind of changes his tune on him and focuses basically all of his support behind the war effort. So, obviously, the Civil War, it's looming right now, it's going on, he's continuing to lecture, continuing to write. But remember, the former enslaved person turned orator, writer, and first published African American, he takes another step in his life. In 1863, he trains to become a medical doctor, and 1 year later, he has his own practice in Boston. He spends his final years writing. He writes quite a few more pieces, and on November 6, 1884, the former enslaved and now noted abolitionist, writer, published author, and medical doctor, William Wells Brown, passes away in Boston, Massachusetts. And here is a bibliography of his works, because I always like a good bibliography. We have his fugitive slave account, 3 years in Europe, his magnum opus Clotel, The Escape, and some of his later works, The Negro and the American Rebellion, which details the role that black soldiers played in the Civil War, The Black Man, which details basically achievements of African Americans up to the Jim Crow era, and other works. And that is the story of William Wells Brown.